Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the Bird's Nest Podcast. I'm Joe Donahue. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had a few hot days in Philly these past couple days, and if the city lives and dies by the team, the only explanation for the weather has to be how well the NFL draft went for the Eagles. The Eagles went out over the weekend. They drafted 6 players to the team, and each of them addressed a very particular need. Now, to help recap and break down the Eagles picks and help us understand what we can expect from the latest draft class, we're joined by the voice of the Eagles, and perhaps a little bit more surprisingly to me at least, because I didn't know about this until last year when we first had him on the show, a college football aficionado, Merrill Reese. Merrill, thank you so much for stopping by again.
It's good to be with you. It's an exciting time for sure.
Absolutely. We start to see all of the puzzle pieces of this roster coming together. April is just really a good time to see, okay, now we've got a clearer picture of at least what the team is going to look like. You're a guy who always calls it like it's like you see it. So the first thing I wanted to ask is, what are your initial takeaways from this draft that just wrapped up?
You know, my initial takeaway, Joe, is I'm happy. It's a good draft. But then I always temper that by going back about 100 years when Dick Vermeil was here and his personnel director was Carl Peterson. You remember Carl Peterson, who later became the president of the Kansas City Chiefs. And he told a young Merrill, he said to me, "You can never judge a draft until 2 years hence. You have to be 2 or 3 years by that draft to look back, no matter how good that draft looks on paper, to really evaluate it, you have to take a hindsight. You have to go back and look at it from afar. And that's something that we have to do. Now, am I happy? I'm happy because it appears to me, not only does it appear to me, it's certain that what Howie Roseman did was take a look at their positions of need and match the best available athletes with that position of need. I mean, let's face it, I think most of us would agree that the biggest need was in the secondary. And he got 2 of the top 3 corners, or in one case, in the case of Cooper DeJean, could be a safety, but he did what he had to do. I mean, he really made a great move by coming up with Kenyon Mitchell with the first pick, and then finding Cooper DeJean available in the second round. Many people, including me, thought that Cooper DeJean would go early in the first round or in the top 20 or 25 at the latest. And he got 2 outstanding corners, defensive backs. And this hasn't happened since 2002 when the Eagles drafted Lito Shepherd in the first round. And in the second round, Sheldon Brown, also in the second round, a safety by the name of Michael Lewis. And all 3 became, well, in the case of Lito, a great player. In the case of Sheldon Brown, a very, very good player. And in the case of Michael Lewis, a decent starter. Of course, I won't add to it. In the next round, they picked up Brian Westbrook. So that was a heck of a draft.
Yeah, that was a real heck of a draft back there. That's probably about as I can't say I was following the draft all that closely when I was that old, but those names and coming on there, those names were just part of my childhood. And the fact that it was that long, that it's been that long since the Eagles went into the secondary for the first couple of picks of the draft is even saying something. But it does seem like, you're right, the Eagles' biggest need was in that secondary. And the Eagles picked up a whole lot of really good folks back there and really strengthened it. Kind of like how last year when we picked up Jalen Carter and then Nolan Smith, and it was one of those things where like we didn't expect it, and we just seemed, at least on paper, we got to wait a couple of years before it actually pans out.
Right. See, you raise a good point, and you actually you've emphasized what I came out with right at the very beginning. Go to Jordan Davis 2 years ago. Everyone celebrated when they drafted Jordan Davis. coming out of the championship Georgia Bulldogs. He was the premier interior defensive lineman in that draft, and they got him. And what did we think? Hurrah! They've got the best interior defensive lineman in the draft. But we still don't know. He has had moments in these first 2 years where he's lived up to that. He's looked absolutely outstanding. And then he has had stretches where we don't really hear that much from him, where he's been more ordinary. Now, he will be going into his third year this year, and this will be the telltale year. Is he the player the Eagles thought they drafted 2 years ago? We'll see. We know he has that talent. But look, again, you're talking about early years back when you were probably in your teens when they drafted Brandon Graham. And Brandon Graham was almost thought after a couple of years to be a bust. I hate to use the word bust associated with Brandon Graham, but he was considered a disappointment. Remember, they moved up to get Brandon Graham, and a lot of people thought they should have taken the safety Earl Thomas. And a couple of years went by, and he had a moment here, but he had injuries. Now we look at Brandon Graham, who is probably going into his last NFL season as one of the best Eagles defensive linemen who will go into the Eagles Hall of Fame one day.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that really intrigues people, especially after the draft, is who are the players that the Eagles actually picked up? I mean, we talked about a little bit. We talked about Quinyon Mitchell. We talked about Cooper DeJean as being the top players. What are some of your initial thoughts about the players themselves that the Eagles picked based off of just what you've seen them do in college?
Well, I think based on what I have seen, I can't honestly tell you that I've seen Toledo on the primetime games. But you know what? In watching the draft, even before the draft, we heard a lot of good things about Quinyon Mitchell. And we also heard that he was one of the standouts at the Senior Bowl. And in watching the draft, I heard Nick Saban, who did a great job as one of the ESPN commentators, talk about Quinyon Mitchell, who he had earmarked as somebody he would have liked to have brought to Alabama and in the transfer portal, but that he was loyal to Toledo and he stayed there. But he said, you know, you wonder sometimes there's somebody like Arnold, who was more of a guy playing in the SEC against big time wide receivers. But then he said, when you saw this guy, when you saw Mitchell in the Senior Bowl, he was absolutely outstanding. He could stay with anybody. That's good enough for me. If Nick Saban evaluates him that highly, then I have to believe that this guy is for real. And everybody said great things about Cooper DeJean. So again, I mean, here's a guy who played quarterback in high school, who was a track star, who was a basketball star, who did everything. Great athlete, seems to have a terrific attitude, and comes from Iowa, where he played some good competition. But they both seem like they are really great draft picks.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be able to take both of them, I mean, the Eagles were the team that came up with the idea of the NFL draft back in the Burt Bell era. And I think Burt Bell would be ecstatic if he had heard, based off of if he had heard what had happened. Again, still a couple years before we have to really evaluate these players, but he would be ecstatic if he heard that we got two of the top corners in the draft. So it real credit to Howie and everybody for making that happen, and a real credit, it seems, to honestly the other players and the other teams that were on the offensive side of the football, where 14 straight offensive players were taken. On the stuff like you can't predict that.
The kid from Houston Christian, the rusher, Jalix Hunt.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say that I watched a lot of Houston Christian's football games, and I didn't see him much when he played for 2 or 3 years at Cornell. But again, he's in the category of a project And there are a lot of people who said very, very good things about his ability. And every
Hmm.
now and then you pick one of these guys that nobody who isn't what you call a household name. I mean, for football fans, by the time the draft began, Quinyon Mitchell was a household name. Cooper DeJean was a household name. Nobody knew much about Hunt, but
Yeah.
Howie knows something, and there are a lot of people who seconded the motion.
Yeah, that was the biggest that was the first surprise name for me. It was like, okay, who is this guy that we're taking at the end of the third round? Because
Mhm.
yeah.
And then they took in later rounds. They started to fill other needs. They took a
Mhm.
center. They took an offensive lineman. They
Yep.
picked up several wide receivers who are
Hmm.
interesting at least. Yeah, and look, you're talking about a team who has two of the best wide receivers in the National Football League, and Devontae Smith and AJ Brown. You're talking about elite players. So this can
Hmm.
only.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have them, and then you also
Well,
have
I'll tell you who
Paris.
else I like. I'll tell you
I'm
who
sorry.
else I like because I have seen him. Because as you said, I watch a lot of college football. I've seen Will Shipley at Clemson, the running back, and I've seen him break tackles, and I've seen great agility. I think he's a really tough, hard-nosed football player. I'm anxious to see him at training camp and how he does. Gauge how he does at this level. I think Will Shipley is very, very intriguing.
Yeah, he was definitely a name that I. What school did he graduate from again? I
Clemson,
forget. Okay.
Clemson.
Yeah. Yeah, Clemson. Yeah, and I heard Nick Sirianni talking about how he wanted. It was Nick and Howie talking after the draft. Like he wanted to get that 4-0 just because he had that competitive mindset about him when he
Mm-hmm.
was there, and that really bodes really well for somebody who wants to make that transition from college to the NFL that many people can stumble in. Many players have stumbled in over the years making
Well,
that.
it's nice to hear that he completed Clemson in 3 years and had a perfect 4.0 average. But I think if you check some of the greatest football players of all time, they didn't have 4.0 averages. So I don't. I think it says a lot for his character. I think
Yeah.
it talks a lot about his academic skills. But I want to see what he does on an NFL football field before we give him any postgraduate Phi Beta Kappas.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of like, hey, that just speaks to his competitive nature. But we
Well,
obviously
it
got plenty
clearly
of time to
speaks
see
to
that.
his brain power and his academic ability.
Yeah, absolutely. We also have a little bit of a reunion of sorts. We saw the Eagles draft Jeremiah Trotter Jr. at the or on day 3 in the 5th round. Fan favorite name, certainly. I'm sure you've had interactions with him even before he got into college when his dad was on the campus of NovaCare.
Well, his dad and I were inducted into the Eagles Hall of Fame
Hmm.
in 2016 on the same night. So his family, Trot's family, and my family got to share one of the luxury boxes to watch the ceremony, and everybody just had a great time. But we know all about young Trot, and as a matter
Yeah,
of fact, I will tell you that I'm surprised that he was around when the Eagles took him in the 5th round because
really.
I didn't think he would go later than the second, and at the very latest the third. So there's a
Hmm.
player who has fallen, but a player who is of the highest character, has competitiveness, has love, passion for the game. I think he's going to be terrific. I really do.
Absolutely. Yeah, again, huge fan favorite himself, but he's got an opportunity now to kind of we know about him certainly, but he's got an opportunity to make his own path and to make his own legacy here in Philadelphia.
Great.
Get his career on the right foot. Um, so what do you talked a little bit about we alluded to the wide receivers that they picked up, Johnny Wilson and Anais Smith. What do you see those guys bringing to the table?
I don't know. I am not familiar with the playing styles of either of these guys,
Okay.
but they've got some size there, that's for sure. And I think they're going to be, again, interesting to watch. But
Mm-hmm.
these are late round draft picks, and sometimes you hit on one,
Yeah.
and more often than not, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of years ago, the Eagles drafted a couple of wide receivers late, including Quez Watkins, and they really never turned out to be exceptional players. I mean, and they had physical skills. I mean, Quez was a talented football player, and it seems every time he got out on the field, something went wrong. And then you remember that draft pick in the first round, Jalen Rigger, and that turned out to be a mistake. No other way to describe it. I mean, he did have a good college career, but he was not what they expected him to be when you translated his skills to the NFL. So you have to wait and see.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were some wide receivers out there. I mean, I don't think it's any stretch to think that Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be a great player. I mean, I watched him at Ohio State. He's the fourth player picked in the entire draft. He's not the fastest wide receiver, but he catches everything and he gets open and he runs over people. I mean, it would be a shock if that early in his career, Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't become a Pro Bowl player. He seems like that kind of a sure pick.
Okay. Now, here we are. We're a couple days at this point removed from the draft. We see this big picture of, okay, here are the players that are going to be competing for that 53-man roster spot over the course of the next several months as they go through OTAs, the mini camp, and then training camp when that rolls around. What still needs to happen?
Well, today it's different than it used to be. The big thing that used to happen was the signing of these players, because that used to cause a lot of drama. But today the players are slotted and they sign. I mean, there's a little flexibility in each of the contracts, but I can't remember the last time that an Eagles rookie didn't make it to training camp, at least in the first few days. So that's what has
It's
to
very
happen.
routine, the signing process now for
The signing
rookies.
process for rookies is pretty routine. The other thing is they have the OTAs. They'll have a mini camp. They have the OTAs, and this is where they get the orientation in the football NFL style. I think it was Hunt who in his interview with the media said to the coach, "Give me the playbook ASAP." So he seems anxious.
That was on his opening phone call. I thought. I think I saw.
An opening phone call. I want the playbook ASAP. Okay, he'll get it ASAP, and he may get a lot more with it than just the playbook. But they have to orient themselves to the National Football League, and I think that they get the real taste of it prior to going to camp. I mean, they get a lot of work between now and the time that they break in mid-June for a month and then come back ready to roll at training camp.
All right. Well, Merrill, as always, I appreciate you stopping by and sharing your insights and wisdom. And I'm sure that each of these new draftees and even all the players that have come on to the team in free agency are looking forward to the day when you call their name on an Eagles broadcast. So thank you so much for stopping by.
Listen, I'm just as excited about calling Jalen Hurts touchdown passes to Devontae Smith and AJ Brown. We're just as anxious to see some of the plays that are made by people like Sidney Brown from last year's draft pick and Reed Blankenship, who was an undrafted free agent. This team has a lot of talent. They really do, Joe. And I think that things went awry after 11 games last year, but I think they've made a lot of adjustments both on the field and in the coaching staff that hopefully will bring a very, very successful 2024 Philadelphia Eagles football season.
Absolutely. It seems very much, as you're looking at everything here, that the Eagles knew what they needed to do, knew how to recover from the horrific end of the season, and are looking forward to rebound in a big, big way. And this draft, at least, again, we still got years to evaluate the players, but when it comes to accomplishing the mission of turning around from that with the coaching hires, and certainly with this draft addressing the big present need in the secondary. It really seems like the team knew what it had to do, and now all that remains to see is,
Yeah,
can the team come together and move forward?
let's hope.
Let's hope. Well, Merrill, again, thank you so much for stopping by, and thank you to everybody for tuning into the Bird's Nest podcast. You can support the Bird's Nest podcast by liking and subscribing to Bird's Nest Media right here on YouTube and by sharing to your social media pages. You can also find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play Music, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, and the Odyssey app. Please check out birdsnestmedia.com for additional Eagles coverage. And if you feel so inclined to support us in a different way, you can find the link to our Patreon in the description below or at birdsnestmedia.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, and let's go, Eagles.